In the last lecture, we learned how to create and use a template-driven form in Angular. Now, in this lecture, let's learn how to perform a form validation on a template-driven form. So, this is the form which we created in our last lecture. Now here, if I open the developer console and if I click on this submit button, it is going to log this ng form object in the console. And if we expand this ng form object, this form has this valid property which is currently set to true. And it also has this invalid property which is currently set to false. That means this form is valid. Now here this valid property is set to true because on this form we have not added any validation yet. Also, inside this controls object, we have all the controls which we have specified in this form. So for each of these elements, there is a property created with the name of that control inside this controls object. So here you can see we have this country property, this email property, this first name property, gender property, hobbies property, and last name property. And if I expand one of these properties, let's say I expand this first name property here. So this first name is of type form control. Okay, so this first name is nothing but a property for this first name input element. And this first name has this valid property which is currently set to true. Okay, in the same way, if I also expand the last name property, here also you will notice that for this last name property, this valid property is set to true. Now let's go ahead and let's add some form validations on this first name, this last name, and this email. So let's say these three fields should be required fields. These fields should not be empty when the user clicks on this submit button. For that, let's go to VS Code, and on each of these input elements, let's add the HTML required attribute. So this required attribute will make these fields required. These fields cannot be empty. Okay, so I have added this required attribute on first name, last name, and email field. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let me submit this form again. Now notice that I have not entered anything inside this first name, last name, or email text box, but we have made these input elements as required elements, right? So now when I click on this submit button, and now if we check the valid property on the form level, you will notice that it is, so let's check the valid property here. So you will notice that it is set to false. That means now this form is not valid and the invalid property is set to true. And in the same way, if I expand this controls object, so here inside this controls object, we have this first name control. If I expand this and if we check the valid property of this first name, it is set to false. In the same way, if we check the valid property of this last name, this will also be set to false. And if we check the valid property of this email field, this will also be set to false. That's because on this first name, last name, and email, we have added some validation. And the validation is these three fields are required fields. So if it does not enter any value in the required fields, in that case, this valid property of that field will be set to false. But if I go ahead and if I enter some text in these fields, and now if I submit this form, and now if we check the valid property, so if I check the valid property of first name, last name, and email, you will notice that now these valid properties are set to true. So here for the first name, this valid property is set to true. For the last name also, this valid property will be set to true. And for the email also, this valid property will be set to true. Okay. And here we have added the validation on these three elements. So the valid property of all these three elements are set to true. That means the valid property on the form level, that means this valid property will also be set to true and this invalid property will be set to false. But if any one of these fields are not valid, in that case this valid property on the form level will be set to false and this invalid property will be set to true. Okay. Alright, now let's see one more thing. Let's enter some invalid value inside this email text and let's click on this submit button. So now if I expand this ng form object and if we go to this controls object and here if I expand this email field, And if we check the valid property, it is set to true. But inside this text field, we have not entered a valid email ID, right? This value is not a proper email. And when the value entered in this email text is not a proper email, in that case, we don't want this valid property to be set to true. For that, we need to add another validation on this email field. So for that, on this email field, required, we can also add this email validation. And now it will also check for a valid email address. Otherwise, the valid property will be set to false. Let's see that. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page and let me clear everything from this console. And here, let's enter some invalid email address. Let's click on the submit button. And here, let's check this email field. So here, let's expand this controls object. Inside this controls object, we have this email property. If I expand this, and if we check the valid property of this email, it is set to false. That's because this email is not a valid email. And since this valid property on the control level is set to false, that means the valid property on the form level will also be set to false. Now, if we enter a valid email address here, like this, and now if I submit the form, so let me clear everything from the console, and now if we submit the form, you will notice that now this valid property of this email is set to true. Okay. All right. Now, what we also want is, if the form is not valid, we want to disable this submit button. This submit button should only be enabled when the form is valid. Okay. For that, what we can do is, let's go to VS Code, and on this submit button, let's use this disabled attribute. And here, let's do the property binding. So let's bind this disabled attribute to the valid property of this ng form object. Okay, so this ng form object has this valid property, right? So we want to bind this disabled property to the valid property of ng form. Now, where do we have that ng form object? We have that ng form object inside this myForm variable. Okay, so here to this myForm variable, we are assigning this ng form. So let's copy this myForm from here. And on this myForm, we have valid property. Now, if the form is valid, in that case, we don't want to disable the submit button. But if the form is not valid, then only we want to disable the submit button. So here, let's also use this not operator before this expression. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And now you will notice that this submit button is disabled. So here, if I click on this submit button, you won't see that ng form object logged here, because currently this submit button is disabled. But if we make this form valid by entering the required fields and entering a proper email address inside this email field, now this submit button is enabled. So now when I click on this submit button, you will notice that this ng form object has been logged here. Okay. Now let me refresh the page here and let's inspect one of these form controls. So let's go to this elements tab, and here let's expand this div. Inside this div we have this form, and inside this form we have this first name input element. Right. So if you notice on this first name input element, there are some CSS classes which has been added to this input element by Angular. For example, this ng untouched, this ng pristine, and this ng invalid. So this ng untouched CSS class is added to this input element. That's because this input element is not touched yet. But if I click inside this input element and then if I click outside, you will notice that ng untouched CSS class has been removed and ng touched CSS class has been added on this input element. In the same way, we can also see that this ng invalid CSS class has been added on this input element. That's because this field is a required field and we have not added any value inside this field. But if we go ahead and if we enter some value inside this field, and if I click outside, you will notice that the ng invalid has been removed and ngValid has been added on this input element. And also ngPristine has been removed and ngDirty has been added, because now this field is dirty field, because here the value of this field has changed. And this is true for other fields as well. So if I scroll down, here we have the input element for this last name. Okay, so if you notice, on this input element, this ng untouched, ng pristine, and ng invalid CSS classes have been added by Angular. But if I go ahead and click inside this last name text field, and now if I click outside, the ng untouched has been removed and ng touched has been added. In the same way, if I enter some value inside this text box, the ng invalid have been removed and ng valid has been added. And also the ng pristine has been removed and ng dirty class has been added to this input element. So this is how Angular knows whether a form control is valid, or it is touched or untouched, or it is dirty or not, by checking these CSS classes. And we can make use of these CSS classes for our own use. So let's say for all the invalid fields, we want to display their border in red color. Okay, so for that what we can do is, let's go to VS Code, and we know that when the field is invalid field, this ng invalid CSS class will be added on that field, right, on that input element. So let's go to VS Code, and inside this app component.css, let's use this ng invalid CSS class. And here, let's set the border, and let's set it to red color, 1 pixel, solid. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and you will notice that all the form controls which has this invalid property set to true has their border changed to red. And since the form is also invalid form, that's why there is a red border on the form also. But we don't want this red border for the form. We only want it for the input elements. So here, let's change this CSS code a little bit. And here, let's say input dot and then ng invalid. Now, if we save the changes and if we go to the web page, now that red border has been removed from the form. And now it is only available on the form controls. So currently, these three form controls are invalid because these are required fields. So if I enter some value in these fields, in that case, the red border will be removed. Okay, but if these fields does not contain a proper value, in that case, it will have this red border. Now here, what I also want is, initially when the page loads, at that time, it should not display this red border for these fields. It should only display these red borders for these fields if the user has clicked inside that input element and then clicked outside without entering anything. For that, what we can also do is, so when we click inside this text box, in that case, this text box will be touched, right? So when a form control is touched, on that form control, ng touched CSS class is added, right? So we can make use of that ng touched CSS class. So currently we have touched this element, this input element. So if we expand this div element, if we go to this form, and here you can see, since we have touched this first name input element, this ng touched CSS class has been added on this input element. So we can make use of that ng touched CSS class. So here, let's also include dot ng touched. So we want to set the border to red color when the form control is touched and when it is invalid. Okay, so let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So initially you won't see the red border for these input elements. Now if I click inside this text box and if I don't enter anything and click outside, now you will see this red border for this text box. Same is true for last name. If I enter inside this text box, if I don't enter anything and if I click outside of this text box, its border has changed to red. And same is true for email also. But if we enter some valid value in these fields, in that case, this red border will not be displayed. Now, we can also show custom validation messages. So for example, let's say if the user does not enter anything inside this first name text box, in that case, we want to display a custom validation error message saying that first name is a required field. Let's see how to do that. So here, let's go to our app component.html, and after this first name input element, let's add a div. Inside this div, let's add this small element, and here let's say first name is a required field. And here, let's also go ahead and let's set some CSS for this element. So here I simply want to set the text color to red. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So here you will notice that it is displaying this message, first name is a required field. Now here we don't want to display this message initially. We want to display this message if this first name text box is touched and if it is invalid. Okay, so for that what we can do is on this first name input element, let's provide a local reference variable. Let's call it maybe fname, and to this we need to assign ng model. Now in this first name reference variable, we will receive the first name object. So basically we will receive, let me clear everything from here. Let's enter something in these text boxes. Let's click on this submit button. So here we are going to receive this first name object inside this fname local reference variable. Okay, so this local reference variable, it is going to have the valid and touched property. So here let's say, let's use ngIf, and to this let's assign an expression. So here let's say if this fname dot invalid, if it is true, and this form is also touched, that means fname dot touched. If this is also true, then only we want to display this message to the user, this custom validation error message to the user. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So initially it is not displaying any validation error message, but if I click inside this text box and if I click outside, now it is displaying that validation error message. That's because this control is invalid and it is also touched, and that's the condition we have specified here. If the form is invalid, if the first name text box is invalid and if it is touched, then only we want to display this error message. In this way, you can also display the custom validation error message for other fields as well. Now, we can also set default value for the form controls. So for example, here we have this country drop-down list. So let's say I want to set the default country as India. So whenever a user comes to this web page, it should always display the default country as India. For that, on this select element, here we are using this ng model. Now on this ng model, let's use property binding, and let's bind this ng model with a property, and let's call this property maybe default country. Let's go ahead and let's create this default country in our app component class. So here let's create this default country and let's assign this default country with the value of this option. Okay, so the value of this option is India. Let's copy this and let's pass it here. Okay, with this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and now you will notice that the default country is selected is India. All right, and we can also use two-way data binding on the form controls. So here let's say for this first name and last name, we want to display some default values. So for that, let's go to VS Code, and here let's first create two properties, maybe first name and last name. Okay, and let's bind this first name and last name property with this first name and last name input element. So for that we can use two-way data binding, and for two-way data binding what we do is first we use square brackets, inside that we use a set of parentheses, and then we use ng model, and to that we can assign a TypeScript expression. Here to this ng model, let's assign this first name property. Okay, and in the same way, let's do the same thing for last name. So here we are displaying this last name, and here we are using this ng model. So let me replace this ng model with this expression, and here let's use this last name property. And here inside this div, let me add a span. Okay, and here let's say you entered and then the value of the first name property. All right, let's do the same thing for the last name. So after this last name, let me add this code. Let's remove this element from here. Okay, and here let's say you entered and then last name. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So here you can see it is displaying you entered, and when I enter something inside this text box, that value is being displayed here. In the same way, for the last name also, it is displaying you entered, and then when I start entering something inside this text box, it is being displayed here. Okay, so in this way we can also use two-way data binding on the form elements as well. Now here what I want is, initially when the page loads, I don't want to display this text you entered. This text should only be displayed when there is some value in these text boxes. Okay, so what we can do is, here on this span, let's use ngIf, and to this let's assign this first name property. So if this first name property is empty string, in that case it will be type equals to a boolean value false, and in that case this span element will not be displayed in the web page. But if this first name property has some value, in that case it will be type equals to true, and this span element will be displayed in the web page. Okay, let's specify the same condition for the last name as well. So for this span as well, but here we need to use this last name property. All right, with this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So initially you will notice that that text you entered is not being displayed here. But if I start typing something inside this text box, in that case only it will be displayed. And if this text box is empty, in that case, that text will not be displayed. So this is all from this lecture. In this lecture, we learned how we can perform form validation on a form created using template-driven approach. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.